Quick overview of what I'm talking about. We're going to cover space operations, what targeting space systems looks like, the vectors for reconnaissance, what exploitation is, micro, macro examples of compromises, and then the foundational problems at the intersection of the space and cyber domains. But then we're going to step into what the opportunities and challenges are for cybersecurity as a field within the space domain. So why do satellites matter? You might think of stuff like Sirius XM radio, your GPS, maybe sat phones. That's kind of what comes to mind when you think about satellites. Probably the most important thing to think about is time. Without space-enabled, highly accurate time, you lose financial transactions, you lose the ability to do a lot of encryption, and a whole lot more than what you traditionally think of relying on space actually goes away. And I think that had a lot to do with like USG and some other organizations classifying space as a critical infrastructure, which is probably long overdue. Obligatory meme with our ancient aliens guy. Okay, so I'm cybersecurity professional background, 17 years in OffSec between DoD and commercial, but for the last 5-6 years I've been supporting the space industry. So when I got into supporting the space industry, this is what I thought a space system was. It's some dish on the ground, talks to a thing in space, not all that much related to what I did for a living. What I come to find out, there's actually a lot of computers up on that thing in space, and there's a lot of computers on ground, and when it comes down to it, these things, especially nowadays, talk TCP/IP to each other. As long as you're inside that hardware encryption, it's a lot like a traditional network, which led me to a lot of other scary discoveries. A little bit of language for the rest of this talk. I'll refer to the bus and the payload. These are different parts of the satellite. Often the bus is what is referred to as what flies the satellite. So it generates power via solar panels, it has the batteries, it does the propulsion, attitude adjustment, so on and so forth. And then your payload is whatever mission that thing does. So you may have an integrated satellite where it's built just to take pictures, and then this is all in the same physical thing. Or you might have like hosted payloads where SpaceX puts a satellite up there and they basically rent space where you can, hey, I want to put a camera on there and somebody else wants to put an antenna, so on and so forth. So when I say bus payload, that's what I mean. So back to the example of, hey, this kind of actually just looks like stuff we hack every day anyways. So you might have a flight control station that talks to a computer in the satellite that handles like tasking and flight. As far as those two devices are concerned, they're just talking to other IP addresses. And now it may go through hardware encryption, and then it's going to get demodulated by a software-defined radio and sent into space, and then the reverse happens up there. But at the end of the day, it's two computers talking TCP/IP. One other thing to think about for low Earth orbit satellites, which is kind of what the flavor of this talk will focus on, is that you don't always have persistent comms to these things. So GPS satellites, geosynchronous orbit, you can always talk to them for the most part. Low Earth orbit satellites, like what SpaceX is putting up there and other organizations, you may only get 15 minutes to talk to them every 2 hours or every half a day, and so on and so forth, which complicates not only operations, but also trying to implement cybersecurity on these things. So what do ground stations actually do? They're not just a dish on the ground. They actually establish communications. They have computers that establish tasking mechanisms for both the flight portion of the bus and then whatever the payload is. And they also take the data down from the satellite and they disseminate it, right? It's up there for a reason. Somebody wants the pictures that they took. They want the signal that they're getting received, so on and so forth. Space vehicle is a generic term common in the aerospace industry to refer to anything that's in space. So when I say space vehicle, I mean satellite. Again, we covered the bus payload thing. So bus power generation. So they generate power with solar panels, but they also have to store that power and they have to moderate its use. PNT, position, navigation, and timing. You may think traditionally GPS, but they also have things called star trackers. Essentially, it has a map of the sky. If it's not sure where it is, it'll look at the stars until it recognizes a constellation, for instance, and it'll go, oh, okay, I'm facing this way. And then based on the change in that picture, they can kind of determine position and attitude and speed. You also have sun sensors, which is kind of just a star tracker with one star being the sun. You have the flight portion of that. That's your attitude adjustment and propulsion. And then obviously communications, establishing communications to the ground and maybe other satellites. The payload portion, like I said, that's going to be responsible for whatever payload-specific tasking is, and then data storage for task creation, data generation, and so on and so forth, disseminating that via the bus. So space is like really, really hard. That's what I've come to learn as being a cyber person involved in the space industry, and engineers will tell you this stuff over and over and over again. So why is it hard? You have radiation, you have single events like solar flares, you have accumulated dosage just from being above the Earth's atmosphere, things that computers don't like. You have temperature extremes. Computers don't like being really hot. Turns out space can get pretty hot. There's a vacuum, stuff that we don't think about with traditional compute, like what kind of solders you use. If there's any moisture in the solder when it gets into space and the vacuum, it can actually pop off, things like that. So they use different kinds of connectors. But we'll get into an interesting conversation on stuff like that later. You also have other space objects, you have junk, you have other satellites, and then you have another environmental challenge which is related to launch and vibration, right? They're gonna put this thing on a rocket, it's gonna shake really hard, and it has to survive that before it turns on in space. So those are the environmental challenges. What operational challenges do you have when you're operating a space system? Testing is a big one. All those things I just talked about, before you launch that thing into space, you're gonna test for it, because satellites are expensive, and you don't wanna put it up there and have it just be a brick. So on the left for you guys, yep, you have a TVAC chamber, which is where they put it in a vacuum and they heat it up and they cool it, basically a big oven. In the middle, you have an anechoic chamber where they're gonna turn the satellite on and they're gonna test things like, hey, if this has antennas and it listens to signals from the ground, but I'm also trying to communicate with the ground station, do those interfere with each other, right? Do they cause problems? Because it's actually happened multiple times where a satellite gets in space, starts trying to execute its mission, and they find out that like every time they try to task the satellite, it interrupts its ability to do something like a SIGINT mission, for instance, because they didn't test that accordingly. On the right, you have a vibration table. That's literally just a really giant table that they put a big satellite on and shook the crap out of it to simulate the G's that it's going to experience in launch. You also have the launch itself, right? So beyond the testing, you have to then get this thing launched. It has to successfully deploy from its launch mechanism, whether it's a rocket like you see on the left, or via the International Space Station like you see on the right. And once it's in space, it has to stabilize, detumble, point towards whatever ground station it's going to find on Earth, and eventually communicate and start operation. You also have power to worry about. That's, again, the most important thing. If you can't generate power, your computers can't work, and you have problems. And then the emanations thing I talked about with the anechoic chamber is something to be self-conscious about. So I gave a kind of a version of this talk when I first got scared about how little cybersecurity there was in the space industry to NASA's flight software workshop when it came through Huntsville. And I got told by many a software engineer from NASA and other places, hey, we do all this other stuff. We do backups, we have gold images of our operating systems, we have scripts that watch for like if power is being used too much, turn stuff off. We have fallback communications, if we don't talk to the Earth for 30 days, maybe go unencrypted. We have resource limiters where like certain processes actually can't access different resources on a space vehicle. When I said that's neat, those aren't cybersecurity mechanisms because if I'm root, I can just use those to attack your spacecraft or delete them or whatever. And so after about a 15-minute conversation, they're kind of like, oh, so where we're kind of familiar with the fact that like redundancy doesn't always equal security, that was something that from an engineering perspective, that not a lot of them were really familiar with. So we classify space systems categorically based on their mission. There's three like high-level mission types. There's sensing, there's emitting, and there's transit. Sensing missions are going to be, radio frequency, optical, it's taking pictures of the Earth, infrared, it's monitoring the infrared spectrum, whether it's a telescope, satellite, looking at the ground, or space, monitoring for radiation, so on and so forth. Emitting missions are like interference, so jamming. You may have laser emissions, you may have navigation signal emissions, or radio like Sirius XM. And then transit. Transit could be anything from transiting cargo to transiting data. So bent pipe communications through SATCOM or space shuttle carrying, cargo and humans to the space station. So why would somebody want to compromise a satellite? Well, it's actually a little different than traditional company compromise because you can do some different things with satellites. So obviously you have collection, like I want to gather intelligence about the system. You have redirection, which is kind of scarier than our traditional examples of like, oh, I'm just compromising this computer to pivot to somebody else's computer. If you compromise a satellite, you can pivot to like air-gapped ground stations that also talk to that satellite, or other satellites that are in different transport layers, and so on and so forth. Subversion, that's kind of stuff we're all traditionally familiar with. If it emits a GPS signal, maybe I make it emit a worse GPS signal. Theft is kind of the most interesting one because you can actually steal a satellite. If I hack a satellite and I change the encryption keys, and the other person who previously owned it can't recover it, like I get to keep talking to that satellite and tasking it and using it for its lifespan, and they never get it back, and they can't go to space to get it. So that's kind of a unique aspect of compromising things in space. Obviously you have disabling, right, turning it into a floating brick. So there's two different ways to get at these things, pre-operational and operational, and the line for that is essentially once it's up in space, wakes up, starts talking to the ground and doing its job, that's operational, everything left of that being pre-op side. So design, development, testing, transportation, storage, launch. Again, I'm not going to get into a ton of the stuff, it's late. I want to get into the juicy stuff. But obviously, if you can, if you're paying a company to design and develop it, and you can compromise that company, you can put in backdoors, you can make it not function well. With all the testing that happens with these systems and the launch, there's a lot of opportunity for interdiction because you're shipping this thing around to put it in all these different test situations. You're then sending it to the launch pad. It might sit there for 6 months until it gets its ride. So that's another consideration a little bit unique to this domain. Operational vectors are kind of architecturally based, at least that's the way I classify them. So you have your ground to space, ground to space, which is the traditional way you would think these things get attacked. I realize I don't have that typed correctly on the slide. You also have inter-vehicle. So if it's a bifurcated system where the bus and the payload are two different things and they're operated by two different organizations, you could potentially compromise the bus via the person that flies the satellite and pivot, if there's not good segmentation on board, into that payload and then ultimately like to the ground or something. You have payload to payload if there's multiple hosted payloads, and then obviously vice versa. You also have space vehicle to space vehicle. As these things go up and they operate in constellations or mesh networks, if you compromise one, you can potentially pivot into others, and then back to the ground like I've already discussed. There's also the vector of compromising these systems at where the analysis and dissemination happens. So if I have an imagery satellite and I spend all this money and I put it up there and I take all these pictures for people, if you can compromise the networks or the computers where the analysis of these images happen and disseminate bad stuff beyond that, right, you're impacting the mission even without having to attack space. So that's just something important to think about. So what are the subsystems you would exploit? So based on the functionality of the bus and the payload, depending on what you're trying to impact, you may only be able to go after the bus to do that, or you may be able to compromise the payload or the bus. So tasking, P&T knowledge, communications, like those are things that the bus and the payload have in common, but the bus specifically controls things like power and propulsion. So depending on what you're trying to compromise, you're gonna go after different things. So real quickly, this is just, I went to a small satellite, which is actually here in Utah, where they have a bunch of people who, largely academic, but they all have small satellite programs they put in space, they talk about them. And a lot of them are like, hey, look at this cell phone app where I control our satellite from. I'm like, that's actually kind of scary. So they're like, well, I don't really have to worry about it. Like, this is just some VM in a server somewhere. Like, nobody can get access to it. And so I kind of just, I'm going to go quickly and so I can talk the whole thing. Like, I just walked the dog on the fact, like, hey, if you have a personal computer, you bring it to that lab at school where you control a satellite from. They're like, yeah. I'm like, do you like charge your cell phone in different places or maybe plug it into the server when you're doing something? Well, yeah. It's like, okay, well, there's malware that exists that can, move and task between all these things. And I walked them through real examples that existed at the time. A lot of that stuff's deprecated now, so I'm not going to mention it. But basically show them, like, you could very easily go from, like, your personal computer via your phone to the lab computer at school, pivot into the VM that is the actual ground station, and then task the satellite to do stuff. Maybe task the satellite to install an update that's actually malware, and now you have code execution on board. And you can do things like pivot into different parts of the satellite, right? And they're like, oh, I didn't realize that. So what does that mean on a large scale? On a large scale, that means that if I have access to one payload on a satellite because I compromise the ground station and I can get up there, that maybe I can pivot from the payload into the actual flight computer. Well, if I pivot into the flight computer, back up. If we have multiple ground stations that operate a payload and I compromise one of them and then I get into space, every time that satellite talks to a new ground station, I can probably compromise that because they have complete trust on what they're getting from the satellite. They have no reason not to trust it. If I'm able to pivot into a different part of the satellite and multiple organizations live there, like SpaceX flies the satellite, Comcast has a payload, SiriusXM has a payload, I could compromise Comcast, but they don't segment well in space, I can pivot into to SpaceX, and then I can do the same thing, right? I'm in a SpaceX flight computer. Every time they talk to get tasking from the ground, maybe I can pivot into a SpaceX ground station, right? Now you've tied multiple organizations, multiple geolocations together via this compromise. Maybe they have a bunch of satellites up there because it is SpaceX, and I compromise the payload that controls the optical link. Now I can pass stuff to all the different satellites that are in the constellation, right? So kind of a scary situation to think about and how it can get out of hand really quickly. So what are the problems at the intersection of the cyber and space domain? And these are really important because this is stuff that's kind of fundamentally not understood well in our industry nor the space industry. So cybersecurity has a cost problem in general, right? We're seen as a tax, and it's hard to get justification for why we have to do things unless you have something like compliance to wave in somebody's face. I would say that in the space domain, it's even harder because communicating traditional cost benefit is something that is a challenge, but that we're all used to having to do. When you're trying to talk cost benefit to somebody who has a space system, you have to go a step further and understand their operational constraints, because it's not just like money, time, labor, it's battery, bandwidth, comms windows, right? And so unless you can frame the cybersecurity risk cost benefit within those parameters as well, you're gonna have a hard time having those conversations with the people that own these systems. Which gets into the culture problem. So I'll tell a really quick story, and I'm going to get some of the facts wrong because I'm doing an ad lib, but there was a satellite called Hayabusa that the Japanese Space Agency put up there trying to go to visit an asteroid for the first time, right? This thing got not far away from Earth on its like 3-year mission to the asteroid, and like half its solar panels failed, and like a third of its batteries went bad. So they had to go re-engineer for weeks on end to figure out, do we have enough power budget to even like do this 7-year mission and get to the asteroid and get back? And they're like, okay, well, we can change programming, you can be smart about this, we can actually do it. So they keep flying. And then before they get to the asteroid, 2 of their 3 reaction wheels fail. Reaction wheels are basically, they spin really fast, and then they put something in there to stop it, and that momentum is what moves the satellite around. 2 of the 3 failed, so they could only rotate on one axis and use propulsion. And so then they had to go cram for another week or 2 to be like, okay, can we still land on an asteroid with only one axis of attitude control on this propulsion thing? And they were like, okay, we think we can do it. We figured out how to do it. They changed programs on the satellite again. They get to the asteroid. They launch the probe. A probe fails, but they still have the ability to crash into the asteroid and like fire this bullet to kick up dust that they're going to bring back to Earth. So they test the gun that's supposed to do that, and it's not giving a fire signal. So then they say, well, let's just hit the asteroid really hard, and hopefully that kicks up dust, and then we'll capture that and we'll bring it back. Well, they do that, and they rupture the propellant tank, and that spews all over the antenna, the main antenna. So they lose all their active propellant, and they lose their main antenna, but they did kick up some dust, so they close that and they capture that. They had to go refigure how are they able to limp home with just an ion thruster and half of their solar panels, 60% of their batteries, right? And also the antenna talking to them has 1/1000th the bandwidth of the main antenna. So they had to rewrite the comms protocol to try to get more bandwidth out of that so they could actually fly the thing. I say all that to say, space is really, really hard. And when you go to them and you're like, hey, but did you patch your satellite? They're like, I am not worried about that. I'm worried about all these other things, right? And so by culture problem, I mean, cybersecurity people, like, we're really used to being like the most risk-averse people. We're talking to like a CEO and we're like, no, you really should worry about this. You need to fix this. And when we talk to space people, they're like, I'm worried about everything, and you are the 10th most scary thing. And so that's kind of a new paradigm to be in as a cybersecurity professional. The other thing is, usually we're some of the more technical people in the conversation when it comes to talking about, hey, you should implement cybersecurity. And when you're talking to aerospace people, they're engineers. Many of them have like electrical engineering background, and they're like, well, I know how the fundamentals of that computer work that you're trying to do security on more than you do. So you need to like prove it to me 10 times before I believe you that you're going to do this thing, right? So just not the usual way of dealing with stuff. Supply chain stuff isn't unique to space. What's unique with space is there's like 4 vendors that make satellite buses. There's like 1 vendor that makes the processors that are used on most of these things. There's like 3 vendors that can launch your thing into space. So if you're trying to target US space, if you're trying to target US space organizations, you could kind of focus on a really small subset of the vendors. And that makes like interdiction like a much higher threat, right? Like both like interdiction in the sense of like compromising stuff along the way, but also just if you can get somebody in at one of these places, you could do a lot of damage. Third-party attack surface problem, that's kind of related to what I just talked about, but it's also all those test sites. TVAC chambers, vibration tables, anechoic chambers, they're very expensive, and a lot of times smaller businesses that are trying to participate in space will be like, hey, university so-and-so, can I use your TVAC chamber for 5 hours? Oh, sure, whatever. But like, you have a college intern running the computer that controls that thing. And maybe they turn it up to 500 degrees instead of 200 and melt your satellite. Has a cyber warfare problem for space. So cyber warfare, it does not make a lot of sense in the tactical way that it's bandied about. So if I'm flying a rescue mission into a country and they're like, hey, we cybered the anti-aircraft missile, don't worry, just fly over it. You're like, well, I really hope they didn't restart that because it sure just looks like a normal anti-aircraft missile launcher, right? You'd be like, we'll just blow that up with a missile and then I'll fly over. Now, in space, there's the opposite problem because people have proved that they can shoot stuff out of space with missiles, and they create shrapnel fields that are traveling 17,000 miles an hour in perpetuity that pollute orbital planes. And so in space, it's actually more beneficial to just make it go dark if you're trying to disable something because maybe you also have satellites, right? And so cyber warfare is kind of uniquely suited to the space target, which is a little bit scary. Space has a big test and evaluation problem as well when it comes to cybersecurity. They're actually really good at testing with all that stuff we've talked about, right? But cybersecurity often just compliance, right? Like, did you RMF? Great. Hey, can I hack your satellite? Absolutely not. Well, that's kind of like saying, I don't need to put it on the vibration table and shake it. Don't worry, I torque measured all the bolts. I'm sure they're not going to fall apart at whatever G's the rocket's going to launch it at. So we don't, from a cybersecurity perspective, everything else gets exercised as well as like a compliance factor when it comes to like radiation and all that stuff, but cybersecurity not so much. Which is kind of interesting because cybersecurity threats are the only ones that are actively trying to overcome countermeasures, right? Like the sun's not going to get mad that satellites are up there and suddenly emit more radiation, but the cyber threat is going to constantly try to undermine what we're putting up there to protect it, and that's the only thing that we don't actively exercise, or at least the space industry doesn't. You may have picked up by now that there's a big defense in depth problem. There's an inherent trust between, like once you're at the ground station and I'm sending commands to a satellite, like there's inherent trust by the satellite, what it's getting from the ground, and there's inherent trust that the stuff I'm pulling down from the satellite is what's supposed to be there, right? So that's gonna change. You get in these huge mesh constellations, there's multiple hosted payloads, there's a lot of opportunity for somebody to do something malicious, and I don't think they're gonna address this defense in depth problem until something happens. There's also kind of a modernization issue. 15 years ago, hacking a satellite would have been really hard. If you got access to the ground station, you tried to task it, it wasn't going to be user-friendly, it was going to be a lot of stuff you didn't understand, maybe custom protocols, right? You have to almost have an aerospace engineer sitting with you if you're a hacker to figure out how to actually do something to the system. Now it's all stripped down Linux, stuff we recognize, it's talking TCP IP. Well, that means that it's easier for us to implement like technological solutions. It also means that the attackers have an easier understanding of the system they're dealing with. Failure analysis is something that the space industry does really, really well. So if a satellite fails, they will convene a board of a bunch of PhDs with people like metallurgical experience, aerospace engineers, electrical engineers. They'll go through every bit of telemetry they have from this thing to figure out what went wrong so they can have that lesson learned and not put another $50 million brick in space. But cybersecurity is almost never brought up in those meetings, and if it is, it's like one of the last things. And the thing I've brought up a couple times when participating in these things is, hey, you realize that the warning that says it failed because of a temperature thing, like I could just change that to be that and compromise it some other way. And like all the stuff that they're using to forensically go through what made the space vehicle fail are all just logs created by the space vehicle that if you had root, you could change. And so it's kind of like, shouldn't that be the first, like shouldn't you try to rule out malicious behavior before you start relying on all these facts? And so that's maybe in the infant stages of being changed, but not something I see being addressed soon. Lastly, there's a huge disclosure problem. By that I mean most stuff in space is owned by a government, a military, people associated with them, or really big companies. And it's not in their best interest nor national security prerogatives to share when bad things happen to them, which means things like ISACs and other organizations that try to leverage that information to secure the base of people doing this stuff are going to struggle. So it also means that our cost benefit discussions that we have with these people are going to be more challenging because you don't have we're a bunch of SCADA people, like, well, don't let Stuxnet happen to you, right? There's no like big hammer to beat them over the head with of fear, like you guys need to fix this stuff. So you may be thinking like, well, what does this mean for the cybersecurity industry? Like if my company wants to pen test space vehicles or we want to write security products for space vehicles, like what does that look like? Well, there's a lot of opportunity, but it's also very difficult. And there's opportunity because it's difficult. So all that stuff I just talked about is why there's opportunity, because addressing those problems requires like a heavy understanding of the other side. And so I think certainly there's room for our industry to really have an impact on the space industry, but it's going to require a lot of cross-pollination and cross-education. But there's technical difficulties that come along with that. So, execution of some plan to do like a cybersecurity product for space is going to require expertise in both fields, and it's kind of hard to just like go get experience working with satellites. Testing and evaluation solutions, as we've seen, is a big part of these things, and that means that if you come to the table with especially like a piece of hardware, but even software, the system owner of a space vehicle is going to be like, well, how have you tested it for space? And if you don't have good answers, you're never going to get past that part of the conversation. So gaining experience, like I said, it's rare and it's difficult, but I think it's becoming more prevalent because more universities, for instance, are getting small sat programs, and I would love to see more of like cyber clubs getting involved with those things. And that's some of the stuff we're trying to push, like in Alabama where I'm from. But the last thing is, managing resource utilization and risk mitigation in the way that we've talked about, like, hey, how many CPU cycles does your security product use? How much battery does it use? Are you going to make sure you don't like accidentally dir the whole hard drive and like waste a bunch of space by creating a log that's huge? That's stuff that kind of exists in some systems, but you really have to tailor it to space. So the thing I like to contrast this with that a lot of people are familiar with is like SCADA and IoT. So the problem with IoT and SCADA was we came in after the fact, right? Like these things had existed for 20, 30 years, and then people realized they could hack them very easily, and then the cybersecurity industry had to come and be like, well, how do we bolt on security to SCADA and IoT to fix it? And a lot of the technologies in space resemble it, right? There's microcontrollers, there's FPGAs, there's things that you would see in those sorts of systems. But the issue, I think, for the cybersecurity industry to get involved here, especially on the commercial level, is that there's high ROI to do the SCADA thing. Like if I had a SCADA solution, I know that I can go to like 100,000 different customers that I know have SCADA systems and be like, do you want to buy my product? It can help you. Getting the experience and requisite knowledge to build solutions for space systems has a much different return on investment. There's not a lot of customers to go have that solution to, and gaining that experience is much more expensive and unique. So just something to think about. Getting back to that whole, like, you have to test the thing you develop even if it's a cybersecurity solution. Well, I will admit that sometimes the space industry will just say like, well, just go buy that Raspberry Pi and put it in a TVAC chamber, and then put it on a vibration table, and then did it survive? Oh, all right, well, bake it with some radiation. Okay, it had some latch ups and stuff, but it went like the equivalent of a year's worth of dosage from the sun without too many problems. You know what? Maybe I don't need the $50,000 rad hardened Raspberry Pi. Maybe I can buy a $500 Raspberry Pi. It just depends on what mission you're putting the space vehicle up there to do. And I just think that's an important thing to understand as you approach this industry with solutions, is that it's not that some stuff can't function up there that hasn't been designed to, it's just that you have to be able to prove the provenance that it's going to survive that sort of testing. Big versus old space, big versus small, is in the past like a GPS satellite, $1 billion, right? Small sat from university, tens of thousands maybe, plus the launch and some other stuff. Big space is going to be really hard for the cybersecurity industry to break into because like they're vertically integrated. SpaceX, for example. If you go to SpaceX with a cybersecurity solution, they're either going to tell you they already have it, or they're going to ask you for enough information to steal that and just do it themselves because they're vertically integrated. The room for the security industry is really in like the kind of new space, like I'm going to put up 10 satellites, I'm going to build this business that takes pictures of stuff, but I don't really have the expertise to do the security side, so I'm actually going to look for people to do that. And that's kind of where I see the toehold for businesses to go for there, where they're going to outsource stuff like cybersecurity. This is just kind of wrapping up some of the facts about space, right? Like flight heritage is king. They would rather pay $100,000 for a radio that's 30 years old that they've known has flown 100 times than pay $10,000 for one that's 10 times smaller, lasts 10 times longer, and has much more reliability. Because they're going to be like, well, I get that, but has it flown? And if your answer is no, they're probably not going to buy it. There's literally companies that will pay for a ride share to put their product in space just to be able to go to other vendors and be like, yeah, I've flown it, it worked. Here's my heritage. So just real quick, going through the customer base, I mentioned it's really small and that impacts the ROI on approaching this stuff from like an industry perspective, but DoD, you've got NRO, Space Force, SDA, which is Space Development Agency, they're kind of the R&D arm of Space Force. You have Space Command, which is like the COCOM command, and then payload operators, which like the Navy and the Army used to participate in space, but Spacecom stood up, took all the authorities to fly things, so now the Army and the Navy only operate payloads. But those would be your customers. Non-DoD, you have NASA and weather people, and then commercial, obviously you've got kind of three kinds of offerings. So you've got hosted payloads, which is something SpaceX does, right? They say, hey, if you fit this form factor and you only need these resources, you can plug into our satellite and we'll put you up on, whatever one you fit in. There's space as a service, which is kind of, hey, if we have a FPGAs, software-defined radios, and we have, reprogrammable satellite, if it's past this 3-year mission, maybe I'll offer to repurpose it, and as long as the antenna and the software-defined radio work for your purpose, I'll like resell it to you as a service. You don't have to pay for the satellite or anything, you're kind of just paying for the NRE to change that. And then obviously you have space-based services, right? That's, hey, this company takes pictures in space and you're just paying them to take a picture for you. Laws, standards, regulations, there really are none. It's like the international waters. So there have been standards and stuff between countries, like when this the moon landing was going on, and the Soviet Union and the US agreed to like certain things about going to the moon, stuff like that. But as far as, hey, my satellite's gonna hit your satellite and I don't have propulsion and you do, can you go out of the way? If the other person's like, oh, I don't think we're gonna hit, so I'm not gonna waste my propellant, like there's no, you can't go sue them. There's no precedent to do anything like that, especially if it's a different country. So just something to think about. Cybersecurity standards for space are kind of just getting started. You've got mandates from like the White House and things that, hey, this is critical infrastructure, we need to start approaching this. You've got RMF overlays that are related to space. You have NIST trying to address the problem, and IEEE has a cybersecurity working group, which I participate in, and I can tell you that getting 70 PhDs from across like 30 countries to agree on anything is very difficult, and it's even more difficult when like half of them are aerospace engineers who dabbled in cybersecurity, and the other half are cybersecurity people who know nothing about space but have been in IEEE. So it's really fun, and I'm just saying that to say I think we're a long way away from like a mature, very tailored solution to doing cybersecurity in space, even from just like a framework and guidance perspective. So if you want to learn more, just a couple quick resources. NASA has a small sat simulator that's kind of fun to play with. It stands up in an environment. You can do things like task it to execute reaction wheels, and it'll turn in space and show you all that kind of stuff. And you can manipulate the like tasking software and the flight software. And you have Sparta, which, everybody done taking pictures here? All right. So Sparta is something the Aerospace Corporation put together. Aerospace Corporation is kind of like MITRE for space. This might look kind of familiar to the attack framework, right? The challenge with this tool, and like I said with space in general, is disclosure, right? MITRE attack framework benefits because they have tons and tons of data, and you can use that to do things like heuristics and forensics and stuff like that. But in space, you don't have this huge dump of knowledge of like how, what steps do attackers take in space and all these other things to be useful. So it's a good start. I think it has maybe some soul searching to do as a solution to kind of figure out how it's going to benefit. This is a picture of the small sat simulator to kind of give you an idea of like once you spin it up. This is an older version. I don't know, does it still look like this?
This is like 2 versions old.
Okay, well,
It looks much better now.
yeah, it looks much better now, but like it pops up a thing and it shows like the satellite orbiting the Earth, and you can task it to do stuff, and you can mess with all the kinds of security stuff you'd want to from there. If you're interested in learning more about this and your company's willing to pay for it, I don't advocate doing it yourself. You can come to our course in 2024, A Space Hacking Odyssey, where we're going to teach hacking satellites, and a shameless plug there. Yeah. Any questions? Sir?
Yeah. Have there been any recorded instances of satellite being hacked?
I can think of 4, and that's 2 in the 90s and 2 in the early 2000s. And then, so like a ground station in I think Norway got compromised by an actor, and it seems like they didn't really understand what they had gotten onto, and they sent some goofy commands to the satellite and then they left, which isn't really what you would expect to see. And then there was NASA's Landsat and ROSAT. That might be the one I'm talking about there. But again, like one of them burned up the optics and wasn't able to talk to the Earth because it was turned towards the sun. And then in the early 2000s, I might be getting my dates mixed up. Most recently you had the Starlink stuff, right? But the news articles related to Starlink and all that stuff with the Ukraine going on, like they're like, oh, it's space hacking. Well, they didn't really hack space. They were just attacking a terminal that was used to receive the internet from space. So no, there aren't really good examples. That's why disclosure is so hard, because even those things I talked about, there's not like this is what the attacker did. It was like, well, they saw anomalous behavior, they couldn't talk to the satellite for 5 minutes, or they saw anomalous behavior and the satellite turned towards the sun and they weren't able to fix it in time and it burnt out its solar panel or something, right? So yeah, not a lot to go on from public perspective. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely.
Right.
That's awesome. Thank you.
You mostly talk about near Earth
Yep.
stuff, which is where obviously most of everything is.
Yep.
But what is, in your opinion, the threat landscape of hacking something that is considerably farther away?
Like GPS?
Probe or Venus or Jupiter, much beyond, where it's a reputational impact
Yep.
to a national pride set? Like,
Yeah, I think
US
the,
wants to watch China, miss by 1,000,000 miles by Jupiter because, they're off by 2.5 degrees.
I mean, I think that's a complicated question with the examples that you chose, because if a country did that, they would then have to come out and admit they did that to humiliate the people involved. Otherwise, they would just be like, well, space is really hard and, a piece of dust hit our solar panel and that's why it didn't work. So from an embarrassment perspective, aside from somebody coming out and claiming it, which would be very similar to like a Title X activity and be maybe tantamount to war, so nobody's probably going to do that. But the threat landscape, everything I talked about extrapolates to other kinds of space vehicles. They have the same space constraints. When you're talking about GPS, yes, it's much more expensive. There's a lot fewer ways to talk to them, and it's a lot more secured. But at the same time, if you got access to the ground station, all the problems I talked about still exist, right? So.
I guess the follow-up question that I have to that is, I mean, again, you're talking mostly near Earth orbit stuff, 50 to 100 millisecond latency pieces,
Mhm.
Maybe a little more, but that's pretty good. Does it advantage the attacker or the defender when you start talking about things much farther away, where you have minutes, hours, or days between check-ins and comms, and the fact that, Voyager's what, a 3.5 day transmission time back to Earth?
I mean, with experience operating in asynchronous environments, like you can tradecraft and con-ops your way around any of those things, and certainly the people operating them do that as well. The one benefit you do kind of get is that from like a power perspective of like being able to talk out to that thing, now it's a less of the risk of like, well, my encryption got cracked and somebody can talk to it from a different ground station. Some of those threats have become a lot less likely because now you have to have a lot more tailored of a solution just to get comms to the thing. But no, I mean, time delay, I mean, there's plenty of compromise examples for stuff that happened in air gap networks where it wasn't like they had constant comms and it might have been days or weeks between events.
Do you think that is the advantage of the attacker or the defender?
I would say maybe the defender, just because of the examples I cited where certain aspects of attack surface aren't available unless you have the physical thing to talk to it, but it's not like it's an insurmountable thing for an attacker. Does that answer your question? All right. Anybody else? Sure.
So, couple of questions. Maybe let me see if I can bring it all in. So there was mostly you're talking about securing it from like someone breaking in and doing bad things to it. But there's also been situations where they've brought like satellites back to life or figured out different uses, which is also a kind of hacking. A, have you participated in that and seen some of that? And B, what do you think the usefulness of that will be as there is more space junk up in there that's running Linux and somebody gets creative and is like, oh, I can put a new kernel on this and like save a bunch of memory and we can repurpose this satellite.
Yeah, I think that some of the things I touched on, like modernization and stuff, are going to lend more towards that happening less. And I mean that happening less in the sense that like NASA had a satellite that didn't have encryption and then they stopped using it and caring. And so if you had your own antenna and you knew how to talk to it, that you just could and you could reinstall something, it's going to be less that and more people put up a satellite, or maybe somebody puts up a satellite for the government and the government had them do it for 3 years. And then after those 3 years are up, they might go, hey, anybody interested in using this thing? If you pay me to change the code on there, then I'll just charge you a service fee. So I think that is going to become more prevalent. As far as the like rogue accessing of stuff that's like derelict, I think you're going to see less of that because encryption is much more prevalent, and the people that are operating these things kind of realize the value proposition of maintaining some aspect of control. And so I think you'd see more of them doing that and then re-offering it, which I have seen. I have seen organizations be like, go to other organizations or security people and be like, hey, Lockheed Martin has a satellite that is past operational window they had for the government. I'm pretty sure this is true, but I'm pretty sure this is accurate. It is true, but they went to a university and said, hey, do you have anything you want to test on this? And you would think that maybe they would go with just like experiments, but they actually ran some like cybersecurity code on there, which was kind of unique. I mean, it was just traditional like snort IDS type stuff, but they got to say they did it on space. So I guess that would be like an actual example of that happening. So the Lockheed satellite was put up there for a government customer. That customer stopped having funding to operate it. Lockheed maintained control of it, and they're just kind of using it for other purposes. Answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Super awesome talk, and congratulations on the Black Hat course.
Thanks.
That sounds super interesting.
Hopefully.
I'll see you there. I'll be providing your tech support.
I'll be there for all of Black Hat and DEF CON. What's up?
So one more question. So
Yeah.
you kind of talked about potential for maybe like having a third-party consulting company
Mhm.
that consults on cybersecurity within space.
Yep.
You mentioned a bunch of the walls that would be there, but in your opinion, is there actually a space for that kind of company that could thrive, for that kind of business?
I think as a standalone company trying to approach that business set, you would have to have aerospace chops and probably people with a background in like either FPGAs or embedded systems, and that, like, it's not undoable, but you would have to already kind of be able to talk the talk and walk the walk. I think, honestly, unfortunately, maybe the bigs are better positioned because a lot of the bigs have aerospace units and they have cybersecurity units. And so if the government comes out and has a contract and they go, we want cyber for space, all those guys are going to weigh in, and it's going to be really hard to compete with their heritage. Now, the product they may deliver, who knows, right? Because you have to have kind of the hacking mindset and be familiar enough with space to really have these detailed conversations that we're talking about. But yeah, I mean, I don't think it's not a realistic opportunity. I just think you really have to approach it strategically, because the ROI calculus is very hard. Not a lot of customers, you know, you got to get in with them. You got to be able to speak this stuff. And is it worth investing time in hiring those kinds of people or getting smart on that stuff to then go approach these customers? Yep. All right.
What's your favorite space show and why is it the experience?
Oh man, see, I was gonna open my talk and pick on him, because I was like, you know, everybody who's in cybersecurity likes at least like Star Trek or Star Wars or both, right? And I was like, well, who likes Star Trek? Who likes Star Wars? And then ask who likes Stargate and ask them to leave. But but me personally, I guess I like Trek the most, but I'm also a huge Star Wars fan. So anything else? I'm doing that next time, Butler. I'm gonna ask you to leave next time when you talk. All right, cool. Well, thanks, guys.